Good afternoon, Canada. Welcome to another True North Report. My name is Andrew Lawton, fellow with True North, columnist and video creator, commentator, raconteur, I don't know, whatever you want to call me. But all of that stuff doing over at tnc.news. Thank you very much for tuning in on this lovely Thursday afternoon, or if you're on the West Coast, Thursday morning for about 10 more minutes. I don't even know what time it is. I've just come back from the United Kingdom. I have no idea whether it's morning, evening, night. For all I know, it's Sunday in the year 2012 right now. But I'm catching up. I am glad to be back home. I'm here for a little while before heading back out on the road for more stuff to cover. But I do appreciate very much you tuning in from wherever it is in the world from which you are tuning in. Thank you. So as I mentioned in that little opening breath there, did just return from the United Kingdom, where if you followed the videos that we were putting on Facebook and coverage we were posting on tnc.news, you'll know I was covering the Tommy Robinson court appearance. Now, this was a procedural hearing, just a little over 2 hours in length, but an important one because it was the hearing that determined whether Tommy Robinson would have to face effectively trial again for a charge for which he's already served jail time. And I'm not going to bury the lead on this. The answer is yes, he has to face another trial for this, and that's going to be on July 4th and 5th. But I wanted to go live to talk about this because it really does connect with a lot of other things that are happening right now. And I couldn't have scripted this all better because everything is coming to a head in Canada and the UK, and I'd say the Western world more broadly, when it comes to free speech and press freedom. And I want to get into some of that today. David in the chat says, welcome home. Well, thank you very much, David. Glad to be home. So let's start out with the term press freedom here, because press freedom and freedom of speech are effectively the same thing. And we view them as different because people tend to hold up journalists as someone that are supposed to be on a higher level than society. But journalists are really meant to be representatives of society and representatives of the people. Journalists should have no fewer rights or no more rights than non-journalists, and they simply have a different platform to advance it. But there's no difference in my mind from the ability for the Globe and Mail to publish a story than there is for my neighbor to write something on Facebook. That doesn't mean the quality is going to be the same. In some cases, the neighbor, I think, might have something better than the Globe and Mail, but the fundamental freedom is the same. So I'm going to use in this discussion terms like press freedom and freedom of speech, not exclusively interchangeably, but a lot of the times I'm going to be talking about the concepts in a way that it could apply to both of them equally. And I think this is important because the press freedom that we have in, say, Canada or the United Kingdom, to go to the Tommy Robinson thing, comes along with a responsibility, yes. If you have a platform, you have an audience, you have a moral obligation to tell the truth. You have a moral obligation to be fair, a moral obligation to be honest and to have integrity. But you do not have a legal obligation to hew to a particular party line or talking point. You may have a social contract with your readers. I think that the Toronto Star has a social contract with its readers to have a liberal bias. CBC, bit of a different story. You know, the National Post, when it started, I think had a social contract with its readers to be a bit more conservative. But again, these are completely allowable. And I have no issue with the Toronto Star having the ability to be a liberal paper. I have no issue with the Globe and Mail being able to be liberal. I have no issue with any outlet, the Daily or the National Observer being a far left publication. That's fine. But my rules on this are very simple. Be honest, be open, and be very transparent about what your biases are. And this is why I've grown into it. I used to specifically say to people, I'm not a journalist, I'm a commentator. And I think that in the last 7-8 years, the definition of journalism has changed a fair bit, or at the very least, it's broadened, because we realize there are activist journalists, there are opinion journalists, there are straight down the middle journalists, there are gonzo journalists. You have all of these different things, and as long as you're doing journalism, you're trying to get the truth, you're covering, you're asking the questions, I think we need to have a very wide line as around what we call a journalist. And the reason I say that is because right now the federal government is going to be putting forward a list of approved journalists. This is legitimately real here. And I'm going to read from a Blacklock's reporter story. Journalists testifying at the Commons Finance Committee on Wednesday expressed wariness over practical or perceived government meddling in news coverage under a $595 million industry bailout. One MP called the program a blank check that leaves cabinet appointees to decide which publishers win subsidies. And this was a response to a story that Blacklock's initially broke a day earlier about how the Department of Finance said to the Senate Finance Committee that there's going to be a list of qualifying journalism organizations. And this is what Finance Canada's spokesperson said. The rules will allow for, quote, say, the Canada Revenue Agency to have a list saying, here are the organizations that qualify for the digital tax credits. So this is quite significant because now we're seeing government decide which media outlets are deserving of government funds, of which media outlets are deemed reliable by government standards. And the reason this is so chilling is because a biased politician who is ultimately supposed to be the one held to account by media is now responsible for determining which media is reliable and which media is not reliable. Now, let me say right out of the gate, I have no expectations of being on this list. I have no desire to be on the list. I'm not asking to be on the list. But I think the list shouldn't exist because I think that government bailouts shouldn't exist for journalism. And we have a few different examples of this. So not only is there the $595 million one, there's also a tax credit project for websites that are operated by, quote, a qualified Canadian journalism organization. And you could have a 15% tax credit for subscribers of media outlets. So True North is a great example of this. We have programs where you can subscribe, you can become a member, and I do encourage you to do it. You can join my Heritage Club, you can join my Patriot Club. Candace has a Heritage Club and a Patriot Club as well. The benefits are very similar. But the whole point of this is that if you join one of these clubs, you should be able to, if you're able to write off your Toronto Star or Globe and Mail subscription, you are also, in my view, someone that should be able to write off subscriptions to an organization like True North, to Rabble, to the Daily Mail, to Rebel, or not the Daily Mail, to the, I keep wanting to call the National Observer the Daily Observer, and that becomes the Daily Mail. They couldn't be further from one another, but I was just in the UK, so I blame it on that. But if you want to support the media, why not support these independent organizations and outlets that are doing this shoe leather journalism that a lot of the mainstream media outlets aren't? And this is the whole point. But now there's going to be an approved media outlet. And it's only a matter of time before this approval list extends to other areas. And I want to give you a great example of this from when I was in the UK. So I was covering the Tommy Robinson case. And to get into the courtroom, the Old Bailey, the famous courtroom in London, you have to, it's not like here in Canada where you can just walk into a court off the street. You've got to be on the list. And they have licensing for journalists. Now, it's not a government license, but they've got in the United Kingdom these industry licenses where you can get a press card. And a lot of government agencies, including police, will only engage with media officials who have these press identification cards. So even though it's not a license, it almost functions as a journalism license, which is a very dangerous thing to do. Because I'm a foreign reporter in this case, I don't have one of these licenses. So it was actually quite an ordeal to be granted access to the court. I had to get a letter from my editor, who in this case was Candace. I had to submit name and address and all of this stuff in advance. And there were no issues getting into the courtroom, but to cover it, there is a barrier. And if I, as just a British citizen with a blog, said one day, I'd like to cover this case and write about it, I would not be able to do that because I would not be, in the eyes of the British courts, an accredited journalist. So we're going one step further than that. We're not just having bureaucrats that are looking at identification cards and having this as a barrier. We're talking about a government that's putting a list of these are the approved media outlets. Well, what happens if down the road the government says we're only going to allow people from this approved list to cover a press conference? What if the government says we're only going to allow people from this approved list to ask for interviews with cabinet ministers? Well, once they set up this infrastructure of having this list, they are giving themselves the license to determine who is or is not real news, or dare I say, fake news. And you know, it's funny, I gave this example. I did an interview about this topic on Ezra Levant's show on The Rebel, but I want to read an example that I gave in that interview that I think is an important one here. So this morning at 8:22 a.m., I got a push notification from CBC, and I'll see if I can actually, if you can see this here. Is it showing up? Air Canada to purchase Air Transat. So very specific, Air Canada to purchase Air Transat. And I know there was a reflection in there, but then I got nearly an hour later at 9:18, another push notification, correction, Air Canada, I got rid of it here. Oh, correction, Air Canada to enter into talks to purchase Air Transat. Air Canada in exclusive talks. A previous notification says Air Canada to purchase. So here's a story. Now, thankfully, the stock market hadn't opened yet, so it didn't have too much of an impact negatively. But CBC puts out a nationwide press notification saying that there is going to be a purchase of Air Transat, and an hour later determines, no, they're just talking about it. Now, this is a mistake that anyone could make. I could understand someone making this error. News outlets always have retractions and corrections. I'm not going to call CBC fake news. But by definition, this morning, CBC was not reliable. By definition, CBC was not reliable. So is the government going to put CBC on the reliable list or the unreliable list? How many mistakes does it take for an outlet to become non-reliable, for an outlet to be non-approved? Will biased outlets that are open and transparent about their bias be allowed on? Will Daily Mail or Press Progress, I did it again, National Observer or Press Progress, will they be allowed on there? Who knows? Would a Rebel or a Spencer Fernando type be allowed? Who knows? And it's not to say these people are asking for it. I'm talking about them as examples. What about Post Millennial? A conservative MP asked in a committee about that. Would Post Millennial, which is a right-leaning publication, be allowed? And this is such a huge thing here. So when we talk about reliable, the reason that I bring this up is because, first off, this is the language that was used in the Blacklock story, but the government has been talking about this entire plan in the context of fake news versus real news. And that's why the approved is so significant here, because they're only going to approve things that they say are not fake news. Well, Justin Trudeau called the Globe and Mail story about Jody Wilson-Raybould in February false. He said it's not true. And he didn't call them fake news, but he might as well have. So eventually, everyone in media is not going to have a social contract or moral obligation to their readers or their subscribers or even their advertisers. These outlets are going to have only accountability to the government if that government money is becoming central to their existence. And as I said, this is starting with this little $11 million tax credit fund, but I just know this list is ultimately going to roll into that $595 million bailout fund as well. Because that's the whole point. How would you as a government disseminate that money if not to outlets that you have approved? So government now has a list, and it's like Santa Claus, making the list, checking it twice, and they're going to find out which media outlets are naughty or nice. So let's look at all the ways that this could go wrong. We know that the Prime Minister's office plants op-eds. We heard testimony of this from Jody Wilson-Raybould, that Katie Telford would call up a paper and plant an op-ed to support whatever the government was doing or someone in the government was doing. So if that were to happen and an outlet said, we don't want to run that op-ed, well, would they turn down the government? would they turn down? Who is going to be responsible for this list? How do you come up with a black and white definition of reliability, of approvability, of qualifications? How do you come up with a black and white definition that doesn't result in political interference in some way? And the reason that I find this to be such a dangerous proposal and a dangerous policy for, I mean, there are a number of reasons, but we are 2 months away from the government hosting a press freedom summit with the United Kingdom. 2 months away. And I've talked about this in the past. I did a video on it. We're crowdfunding for it. If you are able to help us, I would very, very much appreciate it. Over at tnc.news, you can support the crowdfunding campaign to cover the Press Freedom Summit. But Canada and the UK will be co-hosting a Press Freedom Summit about essentially defending the free press and promoting the Canadian and British approaches to the free press. And now we have the government saying we're going to put a list together of the media outlets that we think are acceptable and can be approved. Well, what happens if someone who's not on that list wants to cover the Press Freedom Summit? And this is a great example of something that I'm going to have to go through. I'm going to be going to Chrystia Freeland's office and saying, I'd like to cover this. I may not be on your approved list, but I'm still doing it. I'm reliable. I'm not on your side politically, but I'm an honest, transparent, and truthful journalist when it comes to these things. And it's going to backfire on the government when people start to see or even suspect that there may be strings attached on money that's going towards journalism outlets and media outlets. And I have to say that the connection to the UK in this is that because Canada and the UK are co-hosting the Press Freedom Summit, that's taking place 1 week after Tommy Robinson will be facing a contempt of court retrial in London, England. July 4th and 5th is when he's on trial. The Press Freedom Summit is July 10th and 11th. I'm definitely going to be there for the Press Freedom Summit if we're able to meet our fundraising goal. The Tommy Robinson case is as well important here, because here we have a guy who's being prosecuted by the British government for being an activist journalist, for doing a live stream on Facebook outside a courtroom, talking about what was happening, filming people that were going into the courtroom. But remember, filming them in a public square, a public space on the street. Now, you put this in context, Tommy Robinson, when he was walking into court in London on Tuesday, was surrounded by cameras and reporters. They were a lot more aggressive than he was in Leeds a year ago when he was filming outside the courtroom in the sex grooming case that ultimately got him arrested, charged, tried, convicted, sentenced, and jailed in 5 hours, in 5.5 hours, I think it was. So the UK is not in a position right now to claim the moral high ground on anything when it comes to journalism and journalism freedom. The Canadian government is better than the UK slightly, but now that we're talking about approved media lists, I don't think we can say that as Canadians we can rest on our laurels and accept that free press and free speech and broader issues of journalistic freedom are there, because we have a government that insists it is able to and has a moral responsibility to coming up with a list of who's fake news and who's real news. This has been a recurring theme from Karina Gould, for example. This has been part of the pitch that the Canadian government has tried to put to social media companies to say, you've got to clean up your act or we're going to regulate you into oblivion. And I forget who it was. I can't think of their name. But there was some MP that was all upset that Facebook and Twitter and Google aren't like being deferential to Canada. And I'm sorry, Canada has 36 million people. We are a dwarf in the eyes of these social media giants. And I think that what these governments should be doing, if they're not happy with it, is realize how big of an animal these companies have gotten. But the answer to this is not regulating them. You can never regulate content into being true. And you can never regulate truth in the way that these government officials are trying to. You know, Doug says on Facebook, I think I would like to approve or disapprove of my own list. Thank you very much. This is nothing more than the Liberals financing liberal-friendly news outlets. It's going to be that. I mean, you have two problems here. If you want to take the political angle, which I am, by making a list of government-approved media outlets, you're effectively going to leave out people that are fierce critics of your government. But even if you take a pragmatic argument, it's only going to favor the big boys. It's only going to favor the big boys. The only people that are going to be consistently on this list are going to be your Post Media, your Rogers, your Globe and Mail, your Toronto Star, your Bell. Name anyone else. That's the Canadian media industry for you. Canadian media is dominated by a group of companies that you can put on one hand. You've got, I mean, if you include broadcast, you've got Chorus, Bell, Rogers, and then you add print in there, you've got Post Media, Star Metro, Globe and Mail. And Globe and Mail is a single paper. Star Metro is a network of papers. Post Media is a giant network of papers. So you've basically got 3 print companies in Canada that are in daily newspaper journalism. They're going to be the ones that are benefiting from this. They're going to be the ones that are benefiting the most from the $595 million. They're going to be the ones that are benefiting most from this tax credit that is spawning the list of approved media. They're the ones that are going to be raking in all this money from the government. And again, my answer to this is not the government needs to give more money to the little guys. My answer to this is that government should give no money to anyone in this space. It's the age-old expression, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Everyone knows this. He who pays the piper calls the tune. This means that when someone is receiving money from you, you have a level of ownership over them. There's no such thing as no strings attached money. There can be more strings or fewer strings, but there's always at least one string if you're paying someone. And now we have governments that are giving money to journalism outlets. We now have journalism outlets that will become dependent and reliant on this. This has been the Toronto Star, not editor-in-chief, but publisher John Hondrick's thing for years. He's been advocating for government to bail out journalism because he says it's a duty to protect journalism. Well, no, all it means is that you have to start qualifying journalists with government journalists. We already have government journalists. We have CBC. We have CBC. So we already have government-approved journalism right there. And I'd say as a consumer of it, I gave you an example of a significant error in a story that CBC made this morning. That's not to say other outlets haven't made their own mistakes. It's not to say it's a mistake that no one else could have or would have made. It's just saying that even the government-approved $1.3 billion funded CBC makes mistakes. So if reliability becomes the focal point here, we're going to have a line that will be arbitrarily drawn, that will have a political caveat drawn into it, because there will have to be. You know the government doesn't want to give money to people that are going to be criticizing it. So government's going to be giving money to its friends, and even people that aren't friends of the government will effectively have to start orienting themselves around how are we going to make sure this money is not threatened. Because again, I'm getting one step ahead of this. I know that this list of approved media outlets, which the government itself has testified to in a committee meeting, is going to become the precursor to how bailout funds are distributed. It has to be, because this is the only way they're going to be able to determine who gets access to these funds that are used for the bailout. And we're talking about, just shy of $0.6 billion here, just under $600 million going towards this. It's unconscionable. So I go back to what True North wants to do in the UK in July, what I want to do in the UK in July. How can Canada proclaim itself to be this great provider of press freedom, or this protector of press freedom, when the government in Canada is moving to a place where press freedom is essentially being trumped by the economic dependence that the media will have on the Canadian government? And let's take another angle of this here. Let's say that the National Post, and again, I'm just picking them up as an example, it doesn't matter who. Let's say the National Post is getting access to this money, and for whatever reason, the federal government one year decides, we don't think the National Post is on our approved list anymore. We don't think the National Post is eligible. Well, this decision, which may have been entirely above board or fair, will now be one that's stacked up against columns. You know, if you're the National Post, you're going to say, oh, well, they don't like this story we wrote about Trudeau. They don't like this column that we ran. They don't like that Conrad Black was pardoned and he's got a thing here. By the way, amazing that Conrad Black was pardoned. They don't like all of this stuff, and that's why they took it away. So now it forces there to at least be skepticism about any decision that's made. It's going to be filtered through that lens of content. And remember that the appearance of a conflict is in and of itself as powerful as a conflict. If it could be a conflict, it's a conflict. And, you know, I think that you have to draw some lines and set some limits when you use that. But when we're talking about government money going to prop up journalism, whether it's government money subsidizing or subscriptions to journalism or literal direct subsidies to journalism outlets, this is an inevitability in the future that media outlets will not want to rock the boat too much. And I mentioned Blacklock's Reporter. Look, I'm a subscriber to Blacklock's. They do a lot of great work. They're subscription-based. They are expensive. They're a small team. It's not an inexpensive subscription, but it's a valuable subscription. Are they going to be on the approved list? Do they want to be on the approved list? They've said in the past, if memory serves, they don't want access to the bailout funds. But look, I would love if I could write off what I spend on a subscription to a place like Blacklock's. But all of a sudden, if the answer is no, and I can only write off a Toronto Star or Globe and Mail subscription, maybe as a consumer, I would say, oh, well, I guess I won't subscribe to that one because it's going to be more advantageous to do this one. So by doing this, the government is picking winners and losers. The government is picking among the media winners and losers. And you know that the friends of the government that are lining up hat in hand on this, like pigs at the trough, are going to be the big winners economically. Maybe not in the scheme of life winners, but economically, they're going to be the winners of this. So the time has never been more critical to support independent journalism because this is what we are up against. I mean, independent media outlets are now up against the heavy hand of government supporting the big guys and supporting, I fear, the work that's being done by only those who wish to support the government narrative and the government message. We're coming up on an election in, 6 months? Or 5 months, I guess. 5 months until the October election. How do you think it's going to work out if people are worried in their coverage that, oh, well, if this one gets reelected, they could take me off the list, they could put me on the list? I mean, this is not a discussion that media outlets should even have to be having. It puts them in a terrible place. It puts the government in an even worse place. And for readers, you're wondering who's beholden to whom. That's it. So again, I'm going to make a pitch, and if I sound like a broken record, I'm not going to apologize because we need your support as a media outlet because this is what we're up against. So if you want to chip in a few bucks a month to join the Heritage Club, please do. If you want to support the specific press freedom project that I'm doing right now, we've got a special link to that I'll post in the Facebook once I'm done here. Because again, I don't have all these producers that are doing this for me. I'm doing it alone, and I'm happy to do that. But we're going to post the link to the crowdfunding campaign because someone needs to hold the government to account when it thinks that it gets to set the boundaries and set the limits on which media outlets are supportable and which ones are not supportable. And that is such a gong show that is passing for an approach to truth in an era of untruth. This is how the Liberals are trying to present it. So that's what's coming up. You can do all that at tnc.news. In the meantime, if you want to follow my coverage of the Tommy Robinson case, some videos, did a couple of columns, that's all stuff you can find at tnc.news as well. I very, very much look forward to you sending me any thoughts you have about it. My email address, andrew@andrewlawton.ca. Signing off for now. We'll be back next week. Andrew Lawton for True North. Thank you. God bless, and good day, Canada.